So now that I've settled on my animation, it's time to put some finishing touches on in the form of some environment animation and effects. So I can start this in the animation file. I'm going to end up moving into an effects file, but for now I can just do some basic starting stuff with this animation file. So we've got the canvas shelter here, and we've got a pole that he swings across, and both of these things could do with just a little bit of reaction to what he's doing. So in order to achieve that, I've actually got a simple rig. So a simple set of controllers. You can see I'm just going to get up to the contact point. I'm going to set a location keyframe, and then this is actually going to go upwards because the canvas is going to come down and pull this up. And then here it's going to be the opposite. It's going to stretch tight, and then a little bit of bouncing at the end. So I'll just actually duplicate the original default position and just pull that up there. So this all happens very quick, and so you'll actually, it's fairly subtle, but it just adds a little bit of something. I'll actually embellish that a little bit more in the effects pass, but that'll get us started. Now this pole. So same sort of thing. I want to set a keyframe here just as he starts to contact it. Actually, it's the next frame there. Yeah, no, actually I'm going to set it there. So rotation keyframe, and as it takes the weight, it's going to bend downwards a bit. Don't worry about the hands for now. This is why I'm doing it in the animation pass. Arguably I could have done this in the blocking pass, but I'm doing the environment animation as a separate pass. So it's alright, I can just adjust the hands later. So as he comes up, I actually want that to bend upwards before coming down again. A bit of wobbling at the end, basically, before coming to a stop. So let's have a look at these. It's easier to adjust this stuff in the graph editor, I find. So I think this should probably be bigger. So that's too far. Yeah, see, that sort of feels like it works. So now I'll just quickly get in and tweak these hands. Something like that. This all happens rather quickly in shot, so don't really have to do too much here. But still, it's good to pay attention to detail, I think. Make sure that we've got getting rid of most of the intersections. So let's see how that plays. So there we go, just a little bit of extra. Just makes it look a little bit more natural. So from here on out, we want to actually get a bit more precise. And that means dealing with the Clive rig in higher resolution, which can, as we know, slow the viewport right down. If I, for example, dial it up to 1, well, we're only getting 10 frames a second. So there is actually a workflow that we can use to get around this. The major cause of this slowdown is the rig itself interacting with the mesh, as well as the subdivision. So basically it's how many things we're getting Blender to think about in real time as we scrub through the timeline. We're getting Blender to think about all the drivers and all the constraints and all the things involved in the rig, as well as the armature modifier itself, which is deforming the mesh. It has to figure that out on the fly in real time, as well as the subdivision modifier. It's all these things add up to a lot of calculation in real time, and that's why we get a slow frame rate. And so at this point, when we're happy with the animation, we want to lock it off. It makes sense to actually just now throw away the armature. We don't need it anymore. And also apply the subdivision. So now we can proceed in a higher res. And that sort of thing will actually get rid of a lot of the overhead for calculation, and we'll get a faster frame rate. The way to do this is to export out the mesh as a mesh cache. And that means that we'll have a series of meshes, pretty much like shape keys almost, but they'll end up combining to form the animation that we have. Obviously this means that we can't adjust the animation anymore. Well, if we do, we need to go back to the animation file and re-export. But yeah, this is sort of like a lock-off process. This is like rendering your animation into a mesh. We're going to make use of an add-on. It's called the NewTek MDD add-on. So we're exporting out an MDD format file. And this comes standard with Blender. It's just something you have to enable. So that's what we're going to do. In order to do this, we actually need to have a mesh that we can export. At the moment, this is a linked in group. I can't really export this because it's not actually a mesh as such. So in order to do this, I actually have to import. I'm actually going to just link it in from the Clive rig. I'm going to link in the object Clive. So now he's there as a mesh. It's not editable, but it is something we can export. So this gets a little bit complicated, but bear with me and you'll see the results, and you'll want to do this yourself. It's a very handy workflow. Now, a couple of things about the Clive mesh that are very important. Firstly, he's completely manifold. There are no holes anywhere. There's no open faces. And that's rather important for some of the effects work I'm going to do later on, because Blender has to be able to calculate volume. So that's one thing. The other thing is I've actually included everything to do with Clive into a single mesh object. So some of these things aren't connected, like the eyes, but they are actually all in a single object. This isn't strictly necessary, but it makes it easier because you have to export a mesh cache for each individual object otherwise. This way I'm just dealing with a single object, just makes it simpler. So let's get on with it. What I'm going to do is export out in, whoops, make sure I've got him selected first, and then export out an MDD. There's one I experimented with earlier. I'll just export it out now. Now it does take some time. It can even take like a minute or so. Make sure that you switch up the resolution. That's what I've done. I've set it to subdivision 1, and yeah, and it will take a while. So I'll just fast forward to the bit where we're back from the export. So we're back. Now, rather than save this file, this is very important. I don't want to save this file right now, and I'll leave it as an animation file I can adjust later. At the moment it's in a semi-broken state. It's not going to work for me. So I'm not going to save this file. I'm actually going to make a new file now and delete the default camera and light. Actually, I'll switch on the screencast so that you can see what keys I'm pressing while I do this. It seems a little bit complicated, but just bear with me. It's really worth it. So let's link in the group. So the Clive group here. I'm going to make sure I don't instance the group. So we've got the data in the file, but it hasn't actually made any objects. And with this cube, I'm actually just going to switch over to the Clive mesh. So there he is. And while I'm here, I'm actually going to remove all these shape keys. Actually, sorry, firstly, I have to make the mesh local. It's important. And then I'm going to delete the shape keys. There we go. And I'm going to add a subdivision modifier. Making sure that it's at subdivision 1, I'm going to apply it. This is why I deleted the shape keys. Apart from the fact they're not necessary anymore, it stops you from applying modifiers if you have any shape keys. So there we go. Now we've got a mesh that's subdivided to level 1. So now what we need to do is apply the animation via the mesh cache modifier. So there we go. Find the Clive MDD from before. And where did Clive go? Well, there he is on top of the building. And you can see, even though it's subdivision 1, we are now getting an easy 24 frames a second. So now I can proceed on with my effects and lighting pass, dealing with a high resolution mesh. I'll probably add another level of subdivision before render, but for now, for the effects pass, this is going to be good enough. So I'm going to actually save this file and actually set this frame rate to 210. There we go. So I'll save this file in the comp directory, the newly created comp directory. I'm going to call it comp because this is, I don't know, I could call it effects, or this is basically the final blend file I'll be doing everything in. I'll be doing effects and lighting and composition all in this file. So, I mean, you could split it up further, but just for a single person workflow, this is good enough for me. So comp.blend, there we go. And now it's time, now that we've got our main character, it's time to assemble the scene. So over here in my set file, I've got the layout set from before, but now I've also got a more high-res version. So this is now the one that's going to appear in the final render. You can see I've made a new group called set, and as well as that I've got a background, so it just has some simple buildings and a sky dome, and that belongs to a set called called set BG. So that's the background, and then I've also got the lights, which belong to another group called set lights, and these are all just groups I can link into my comp file. On top of that, I've also got the elements I'll be using for my effects and simulations, and so I've got the wet cement, which is basically just a subdivided box, and then I've got the shelter canvas, I've got the shelter canvas trim, and because I'll be running a cloth simulation on this, I want it to interact with this bar here, so that's going to be used as a obstacle for the cloth simulation, so that's separate as well. None of these objects sit inside the set group, as you might expect, because I'll be pulling them in and using them locally. So now to generate some mesh caches for these objects that are animated by the set rig. So over here in the animation file, I'm going to repeat that same process as we did for Clive to generate the mesh cache. I'm going to link in the objects, the shelter canvas, canvas trim and shelter bar, and as before I'm going to make it local, all of these, and I'm just going to copy this name, shelter canvas, and let's just export out MDD. Now you'll notice that's a lot faster than before, and it's basically because it's a simpler mesh, I think. So let's just repeat. And finally the canvas trim. So there we go, we've got our mesh caches exported. Just make sure that they animate. Yep, they do, that's good. So without saving the anim file, now going over to the comp. So firstly I'm going to link in those groups from before in the set file. Got the set lights and the set BG, and they've all come in at origin, which is important. And because we've got so many elements now and things get in the way, I'm going to move things off into different layers. So Firstly, I'm going to move the layer, I'm going to move the set group over to layer 3. I'm going to move the set background, the set BG to layer 4, and the lights over there to layer 5. Now to bring in those objects from before. So we've got the canvas trim, and the bar, and also, while we're here, the wet cement. Let's link those in. And as before, just make them local. So you might wonder why I'm not appending rather than linking, and that's because I want to keep the links with the materials, so I can still go back and edit my set if I need to change materials. But yeah, so I'll just do the same here. And now we're pretty much ready. We have to basically now just remove any parenting that there might be. And now that one's fine. And also remove the armature modifier. So now also I'm going to put in the mesh cache. So let's, on before, shelter canvas, shelter bar, and shelter canvas trim. So they should all animate for me. Cool. So over here you can see the set isn't animating yet, so obviously I need to make my proxy rig for this. Let's do that. There we go. And obviously we need a camera, so let's add one of those dolly camera rigs. And now it's time to bring across some animation from the animation file. Let's link in some actions. So I want the set action, and I want the dolly camera rig, or the dolly rig action. So over in the action editor, let's switch over. I'm going to dial up the dolly rig action, and for the set, getting the pose mode, I'm going to dial in the set action. So now we have all our animation restored. Only one thing is it's a bit of a shortcoming of this dolly camera rig. Unfortunately, it doesn't record the field of view in the action, so I'm going to have to manually set that. But if we recall, it's actually just 45. So I'll just, there we go. So now we've got, and you'll notice it's still running at nice easy 24 frames a second, so we've got nice high res stuff happening without much of an overhead for the processing, which to me is pretty cool. So I'm going to start out with the canvas, which is already animated, but I think I can make it look a little bit better by making the canvas deform around the feet a bit more. So this is a perfect time to use the warp modifier. The warp modifier is very handy for this sort of thing, like freeform deformation. It's a handy little tool written by Campbell Barton. He actually worked on it while we were working on Sintel, and I got to use it to animate the blanket as Sintel goes to sleep. So basically what I'm going to do is put the 3D cursor roughly where the foot is contacting the canvas. Actually, it's probably better to go to the contact frame. Yeah, so about there. It can be a little rough, there's no big deal there. So I'm going to add a sphere, empty, and I'm going to scale it to about the size I want this warp to be. So something about there. So I'm going to make a note of that, 0.26. I'm going to add another empty. This time it's going to be the arrows. Just scale that down so it's about in a similar scale. And I'm going to actually parent that arrow empty to the sphere. So now I'm going to name the first one WRP, foot L from. Seems like a strange name. Hopefully this will become a bit clear as I continue. The next one I'm going to call it the same thing, but I'm going to call it 2. So now selecting this canvas, I'm going to add a subdivision surface, and now I'm going to add the warp modifier. And here you can see we've got regions where we can select a from and a to object, so that kind of explains the names from before. And if you recall, the radius I set for this sphere was 0.26, so I basically used the sphere to measure what sort of units to put into here in the radius. So now I've got the ability to warp this canvas pretty much however I want. This sphere defines where it's warping from, and the arrows define where it's warping to. So you can see how powerful this is. And yeah, I really like this as a way of animating, especially for doing fix-ups at the end. So I'm just going to actually repeat this process for the right foot. Just duplicate this over to about the point on the canvas where it's going to contact, and change the names. Do something a bit more appropriate. Here we go. Oops. Yeah, there we go. Now, empties are, very useful for things like this, but there's a few shortcomings of animating with empties. Firstly, they work in world space, so they're not really like an armature which is working in pose space. And what that means is, so for example, if I grab this and warp it over here, if I want to reset that, normally if it was an armature you'd go Alt G just to reset the location, but you can see because it's in world space it goes to 0. So this is why you have to make use of the 3D cursor. Snap the cursor to the sphere and then snap these arrows to the cursor. So that's one pitfall. The other one is that each object, because they're individual objects, they each get their own action. So we can't just work in the action editor, we have to work in the general dope sheet and have all these other keyframes visible. So, two minor pitfalls, but it's really no big deal. So next, I just actually want to set up another warp modifier for this right foot. Just finish this job off. Just select from and to, and once again 0.26. So I have to make sure I've got keyframes set for these contact positions. Looks like I have, I just want to make doubly sure. And as we go down, I think, let's find out the point at which they're really pushing the hardest. I think about there actually. So I'm going to drag each of these empties downwards and warp it. Now don't worry about the fact that this isn't really contacting. This is really where we're going for believability over realism. So you can see this actually just looks plausible, it looks believable. You can see a bump and it looks like it is from the foot. So once again, believability trumps realism. So I'm just going to move this down, do the same thing again, deselect and warp. And you can see how powerful this is. Now as we come back up again, well, I want to do a couple of things. I want to actually warp in the opposite direction, but I also want to, I don't want it just to be too precise bumps. I want to actually have a bit of an overall bulge to the canvas. So I'm going to actually just grab all of these initial positions and just copy them over. let's find the frame. It's actually this frame. It's the frame after it goes tight. Actually, so yeah, this frame here. And then it's going to return back over about 3 frames, I think. Maybe 2. We'll see. But now let's just warp these out. And as I said, I don't really want these too precise bulges, so I'm actually going to animate these warp modifiers. And so here, well, let's set the keyframe about here. I'm going to set a keyframe on the radius and then advance forward to about here, and then I'm going to just make the radius. Yeah, pressing shift on one of these sliders helps it scrub over a smaller amount, which is handy. There we go. Now, actually, I've warped it in a. Actually, want it to go more in that direction. So it seems a little cartoony and over the top, but actually, as we play it, you can see it actually works pretty well. And especially as we're seeing it go past quickly in the camera move, it's just basically a little embellishment to the whole thing that just gives it a bit more of a physical sort of feeling. It's basically like a cheap form of cloth sim. But yeah, you can see it's fairly effective. So next up we've got the canvas trim, and on this one I'm actually going to use cloth sim. So this is where we get a little bit more complicated, but it's actually not that tricky. So selecting the trim, I go over to the physics tab and add cloth. Now I've actually set up a pinning group already called canvas pin, and you can see if I go into weight paint mode, you'll see basically everything up the top is part of the group and everything down the bottom isn't. And that just basically means everything in the pinning group is going to be pinned to its location and won't be subject to the cloth sim. So let's have a look at these settings. Basically all I'm going to do is set on self collision, turn it on, because basically I don't want the cloth to go through itself, and also I don't want it to go through the bar. So in order for that to work, I need to make the bar into a collision object. So now I should just be able to run the sim. So on the cloth cache, make sure I'm not doing more work than I need to. I'm going to start out maybe frame 80 and end at 210. So let's bake. It's fairly quick. Let's have a look at how that turned out. So there you go. Now I could probably tweak these settings, to be honest, a bit further, and if the camera was lingering on this bit, but for now you can see it's just enough to give the impression that it's made of canvas and it's reacting to what he did. So the last touch I want to add to this is just make it so that we have a bit of thickness to this cloth, because as you can see it's just a plane basically, well, you know, a rearranged plane. It's not a manifold mesh. So I'm just going to add a solidify modifier to it. Just give it a bit of thickness. That actually seems to have come up with a nice little default 0.1. Seems pretty good. And there we go. So now we've got the canvas nicely animated. The pole's doing a little bit of a jump as he goes round. So lastly, we have to move on to this wet cement. So in order to do the wet cement, I'm actually going to make use of the dynamic paint feature in Blender. Just move the camera off onto another layer. But yeah, this feature is very handy for doing this sort of thing. Back in Sintel days, I had to actually hand animate shape keys in order to get the footprints in the snow. But now this sort of thing is a lot easier now that we have this feature. So firstly, I'm going to increase the subdivision. And over here in the physics tab, I'm going to add dynamic paint. And I'm going to make it a canvas. I'm going to add a canvas. So the canvas just means this is the thing being painted on. So over here for Clive, I'm going to make him into a brush. So I'll add a brush. And making sure that mesh volume is selected. As I mentioned before, Clive is a manifold mesh. There's no holes in him. So that's the only reason I can use this. If you have a character or an object that has holes in it, this technique will not work. So back here, selecting the canvas again, I'm going to select displacement. And one thing you'll notice is even just scrubbing in the viewport, it's already, you can see it happening. It's being displaced. So it's already happening. It's that quick. But I'm just going to fine tune a few things. Firstly, I'm going to add Clive to a new group. Oops. And I'm going to call that brush Clive. And over here, I'm going to select that as the brush group. This, as you saw, is not strictly necessary. If this is all we're doing, then it'll work without having to use that brush group. But because I'm going to do other stuff using dynamic paint, I really want to separate out what brush group is being used to displace the cement. So now it's really just a case of tweaking a few of these settings. Firstly, I want to switch up the sub steps. As you can see, we're getting like stepping here in the displacement, and that's because it's doing it per frame. And if you increase the sub steps, it's now doing several steps. It's calculating several times a frame. So we'll be able to get rid of this in-between sort of bump. And that's about it. Basically set the frame range, start at 117, because that's about where, just before he lands. And now it's just a case of baking it. Should be fairly quick. It is slowed down a little bit by the sub steps, but not that much. And any second now, we should have displacement. There we go. See, nice and easy. Now I can actually increase that displacement because I just want to make it push down just to make it really obvious, especially from the camera angle. If we just go back to the camera angle, just want to make it really obvious. And as he moves, yeah, should work. So next up, I want the cement to rub off onto Clive. So now the tables have turned. Now we're actually going to make use of the cement as a brush. So add a brush. I'm actually going to make it paint in pure white. And I'm going to add the cement to its own group as well. I'll call that brush cement. There we go. And this is where Clive starts to look really weird. I'm going to add a canvas and get it to paint. Oh yeah, also I have to add vertex colors. So might as well call it something like cement or something. So basically what we're going to do here is make a mask for the materials. And this is going to paint onto Clive. Now, I'm going to tweak a few things. In the initial color, I want it to be black. In the dynamic paint output, I want to make sure I select cement there. I don't need a wet map. That's for real painterly effects. This is going to be good enough as it is. So there you can see already we've got white appearing. And if I just bake that now, it'll just be baked to the vertex color. So let's just do that. There we go. And as he lifts up his hand. Interesting, I didn't actually select the brush group. maybe that doesn't matter that much. Let's do that again. And there we go. Yeah, well, it works fine. So now he's got cement on him. Now to just tweak the material so this is going to work. So over here, actually I'll first work here. I'm going to get rid of Clive gloves and make a new material. Call it gloves cement. There we go, and we're going to use nodes. So over here, let's go to the compositing section, and this material, I'm going to dial up Clive gloves again. Just duplicate this. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Whoops. Here we go. Over here, I'm going to dial up cement. Wet. There it is, wet cement. There we go. And now, just have a mix RGB node. And now I just need to add a geometry input, where I'm going to use the vertex color. Now I actually have to go through a converter here just to put in a color ramp, just to convert it nicely. Whoops, here we go. Something like that, and I'll just reconnect. Sorry, you can see I'm not really the best material guy in the world, but this should work when we render it out. Making sure to select cement in the vertex color group there. Now let's go back to the default, and if we just quickly render it, whoops, yeah, I've got to make sure the lights are visible, obviously. There we go. So he's displacing the cement, and the cement is being painted onto him. And that should do us. We've got enough effects animation into this scene to make it look, believable, and to spice up our animation a bit. And yeah, I hope you've gotten something out of this course. I've certainly shown a few new techniques that weren't available to me when I was starting out in Blender, and hopefully you can apply these to your own shots. Certainly I hope you don't try to just repeat this shot, but just try to do your own sort of physical animation and muck around with some character effects and environment effects. It's actually a lot of fun coming up with challenging, interesting ways you can stretch Blender's capabilities. So that's it for the course, and see you next time.